And I will let her take a minute if she wants to introduce herself, otherwise jump right in. But thank you very much for being here and looking forward to the presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can everyone in the back hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. So my name is Mikhaila, and I am a postdoc at the Department of Life Sciences Communication, which is kind of like tucked away next to soil sciences, that way?
Yeah.
That way, tucked away next to soil sciences and microbio. So it's like one of the oldest buildings on campus. If you're ever interested in visiting, I highly recommend coming over. But I actually came to Madison originally for a master's in public affairs. So it was actually the La Follette School of Public Affairs that attracted me here, and the Energy Analysis and Policy program, which I know some of you here are very aware of. EAP was like a big part of my experience in grad school, and while I was kind of doing the energy policy degree, I got kind of swept into the science communication world. I didn't know anything about science communication. I took a class with Dieter Schweifele and was recruited into the PhD program. Spent 4 years doing that, and just finished. I defended this summer, which was like, woo, so exciting, yeah. Fantastic and really exciting that I get to stay here. I was thrilled to be able to have a postdoc that I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my presentation through the Department of Energy that is actually working in collaboration, my department and the Nuclear Engineering Department with the chair over there, Paul Wilson. So a lot of the work that I've been fortunate enough to do at UW has been, as Paul kind of hinted to, very collaborative. And collaborative in a lot of different ways across different disciplines, but also I've had the fortune of working with different communities. I'm very excited to have Steve Vavras here, who has helped me with a project that I'm working on with the city of Beloit, and I'll talk in depth a little bit more about that today. But overall, I kind of just want to give you an overview of some of the work that I do and some of the theoretical kind of foundations that drive that. And I'm going to be coming from a science communication perspective, and if you don't know much about science communication, LSC, our department here on campus, is actually the best science communication program in the world. We are niche, so we're social scientists that study how people perceive controversial science issues. As you might kind of think, the first things that come to your head, we did a lot of research on COVID. We did a bunch on gene editing, especially when it comes to GMOs, kind of working with the food sciences here on campus. A lot of recent research that I've done has been on AI, but my personal interest, given my kind of energy policy background, is really in energy technologies and climate change. So I'll talk about different science issues, but I will focus a bit on climate change since that's something that you all are interested in also. So before I kind of get started, I like to ask this question to my students when I'm talking to them, research lab mates, but also community members. You know, when I'm in a community, it might seem very obvious what a community is. But I'm just kind of wondering, if you were to say what your community is, like what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And maybe just like shout out a couple of examples.
Madison.
Madison, okay, fantastic.
Scientific.
Scientific community, beautiful.
Families that go to my kids' schools.
Okay, great. So kind of your friend group, your kind of intimate community. Anything else pop into people's minds? What about local? When you think of the term local, what does that kind of raise in your brain?
Place-based.
Place-based, awesome. Yeah, so thinking about thinking of a place and that being kind of how you define that place can then be that local community that you might be working with. I like to kind of focus on this because the definition is actually really complex. It sounds really obvious. We all know what local is. We all know what community is. But there's actually a lot of literature around this and a lot of different definitions of these two things. So when thinking about community engaged research, understanding what communities you're talking about. Are we thinking about online communities? We have a whole world that is not physical that has a lot of communities within it. And as media scholars, we spend a lot of time thinking about how online communities and kind of online information can impact how we perceive and how we build attitudes about different controversial science issues. our communities, whether they be geographic, whether they be ideological, maybe you're like in an environmentalist group, that's what that tree is kind of signifying, or maybe, you know, my whole family's in Chicago. I've never actually lived in Chicago, but I like have like every time I see a show like The Bear, and they're like Chicago references, I'm like, yeah, Chicago. Or even the Midwest more broadly. I was born in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm here for grad school. I love the Midwest, a lot of the work I'm doing, so I really identify as a Midwestern through and through. These kind of community and cultural identities that we hold within ourselves can be drivers of our own attitudes and behaviors about science issues that we're going to come into contact with. And, you know, we throw around the word climate change all the time. Climate change is what we would call a wicked science issue. Has anyone ever heard of this term before? Okay, seeing some nods. So we talk about this a lot in our classes. The idea of the fourth industrial revolution, which was coined in like 2015, I believe, from the World Economic Foundation Forum, it represents advances in science and technology that have really kind of pushed beyond anything we've seen before, kind of merging different types of sciences, the physical, the digital, biological world. So we're no longer kind of thinking about these things in individual buckets or in silos. The issues that we're facing today, whether it's AI, COVID, gene editing, or kind of the future of nuclear power, they really combine a lot of these different areas of science and social science in ways that we haven't really been doing that kind of complex work before. And these wicked science issues, they're defined in a way, or the way that we define them, or they have been defined, or that they're issues that raise questions that have lifestyle or social societal implications, where there are often where there have to be compromise between competing values or stakeholders. So people on different sides that have different perspectives about what should be done, and where there is no one best solution. Climate change has been argued by some to be a super wicked issue, and I really like that framing, because when I talk about climate change, especially if I'm talking with folks that are maybe not already on the climate advocacy side of things, you know, I like to think about climate change as this broad umbrella issue, where within it there are so many other aspects of climate change that are related to climate change, but maybe not specifically about the global temperature changing, right? Talking about kind of like acidification of our oceans, maybe the melting of permafrost, maybe we're interested or worried about how ecosystems are shifting and birds are migrating differently, all the way to energy technologies, right? Where I focus a lot of my work in deep decarbonization of our economies and how that's going to impact us as a society and as a global economy. So climate change is this huge thing, and when we just say climate change, we don't really know what people are thinking. Right? And that is one of the reasons why it's a complex issue, and one of the reasons why communicating about it can be really difficult. And I'm going to talk about some of the other reasons why it's difficult. But one of the things that I kind of want to, has anyone heard about post-normal science? So this is a concept that is not new, it's like from like 1993, but the idea is that like post-normal science, when there are really high systems uncertainties, and really high decision stakes, and we need to make decisions. We need to like create policy about science issues, where science meets society. This is where post-normal science is needed. And post-normal science is kind of this fourth industrial revolution, science that kind of combines all of these different things, where we're in really interdisciplinary teams, and as we would argue, where we also need the public to be involved, or different publics to be involved. As has been argued, purely technical expertise, it's just not enough to address the complexities surrounding scientific issues that have not only technical, but also social, ethical, legal dimensions. So we are really focused on that intersection, and how science within society kind of creates all of these other considerations that maybe aren't being thought about by the technical experts, or maybe aren't even being incorporated into the research questions or into the design of these technologies. And some of the questions that we have is like, why not? Why not incorporate public opinion into design of technology? Might that actually help us design technologies that are more useful to the communities that we might be targeting? Lots of questions there, right? And there is a lot of research being done. and a lot more yet to do. So to give a little bit of context, kind of theoretical context, when we talk about public opinions and kind of how people form attitudes and behaviors about different science issues, again, I'm kind of going to continue to say science issues and give examples related to science. This comes from psychology, so this relates to any issues, how we form opinions about anything. But the way that we have characterized it in the past is that there are kind of like 3 levels that we like to study or incorporate as variables when we're trying to measure and empirically analyze how people are forming opinions about things. And this is individual level characteristics, what we call our information climate, and then our socio-political and cultural context. So the way I like to talk about this is like if you've ever seen Shrek, and he talks about, you know, being like an onion. There are a lot of layers that represent the complexity of our beings. Everybody has individual level characteristics, their personal social identity, aspects of themselves that really drive their opinion or the way that they see the world around them. Everyone is surrounded by an information climate. It's anywhere where you get information. That might be social media, but it might be your pastor. It might be your best friend. It could be your professor, the things that you're reading. It could also be the television shows that you're watching, right? It's not just places where you're looking for information for facts, but all of the information that you see and consume around you at any given point. And then this broader socio-political and cultural context that we don't really have a lot of control over, right? We're born into a year, into a moment, and whatever we're dealt with is, you know, what we're dealt is what we deal with. And so understanding that we all have these kind of layers to ourselves, it can get really, I think it can be easier to understand how complex it can be to frame science issues in ways that resonate with people, given the complexity of how we form attitudes and opinions. But we can, and we can think about it in empirical ways. Combining that with some of the newer work that's been done in socio-technical systems transition research, which is really interesting stuff. There's a researcher, Chelsea Shelley. Dr. Shelley's up at Michigan Tech University, and this is from work that she has been doing or has done with communities in northern Michigan. And if you kind of look here, it kind of flips this inversely. So we start with socio-technical system transitions. Think of like the energy transition as one of these where there's broad changes across or transitions within every part of our economy and our society. That has regional impacts, community impacts, and household impacts even. And so how do we think about questions that we might ask at every single one of those levels, and how are systems changing? What are power dynamics happening at these different levels? And what is it that we can learn from those different aspects? And how can we encourage or engage folks from those different kind of levels to think about whatever question it is we're interested in. In this case, it's, you know, like perceptions of solar or wind or different renewable energy sources. When thinking about how people are forming opinions, oftentimes there is this like assumption in the more technical space or with maybe basic or bench scientists that are really focused on developing their research and providing data that supports what they're doing. There is this idea that if we just provide that data from this amazing research that we're doing here and elsewhere to people in some form, that they will take that data and it will change their opinions and attitudes, that it will actually make some kind of difference to them. Unfortunately, there's decades of research in psychology and in our field and elsewhere that show that that's just not how it works. Our brains can be counterintuitive. You can give people data and graphs and it can mean nothing to them, right? Or they can sometimes twist it using motivated reasoning to fit the way that they see the world. And so even though we might really, really want to just provide more information to people, that's actually not a very effective way to communicate with them and to reach them. We have to reach them where they are, and we have to understand how information and knowledge matters to them, because it's different for different groups. And it could be different for an individual in different situations. So understanding who we're working with, understanding our goal, when it comes to communicating about science issues is really important. Knowing who your audience is a huge part of this work. And community engaged research is a really effective way to learn about your audience, right? Incorporating them into the research process, you learn a ton about them. So another thing that we kind of focus on, I'm kind of blazing through some of the things that we talk about in our courses. If there are grad students here and you're interested in science communication, we have a wonderful minor in SciComm where you'll like kind of dive into more of these things and the science behind them. But low information publics, and all that means is that like kind of lay people, folks that don't know something about something, they make sense of that information through different filters. And these filters might be how the media defines something around them. What do my friends or family think? How much information do I need to decide? And how might those interpretations fit within my beliefs or other values that I hold? It's really, really crucial that we understand these specific contexts in which we operate. So knowing which one of these things are most salient to people as they're trying to form opinions or as they're looking or seeking for information to help them form opinions about something. If we don't know where they're coming from, it'll be a lot harder for us to provide information that's useful to build awareness that they're looking for, right? And we use what are called heuristics or mental shortcuts to do this. So what are, just kind of like, if you've seen this kind of research before, you know what I'm talking about, feel free to shout them out, but what are heuristics in your life? Like what heuristics do you use? What mental shortcuts do you use when you're not sure about something and you need to learn about it? Or you want information about something so you can form an opinion. Maybe it's like AI, didn't know much about AI, generative AI comes out, now your grandma's asking you about how, if you're using ChatGPT to cheat on your exams or whatever, right? How do you form an opinion about that? What would you do? Is the question. Answer.
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia, great, okay. So online search engines, what else? Where do you look for information about things?
Tutorials.
What was that?
Tutorials.
Okay, tutorials, yeah, great.
Ask my parents.
Parents, yeah, especially in younger kids, right? That's like a huge, the moment that I realized that the stuff that my mom said to me wasn't always true, and I've just been like walking around the world like spouting lies that I didn't realize I was spouting. What else?
Twitter.
Say that again?
Twitter.
Twitter, social media, that's a huge place, especially for students these days. The class that I talked to yesterday, apparently a ton of them get their news from TikTok, right? So there were some students in the class that had like the New York Times app on their phone or listened to some NPR or Vox podcast, but for the most part, they were going to social media to find information about the news that they see. That's very different from my grandma who watches, news on TV every day, so still has a cable subscription. So the ways in which we kind of gain information and the heuristics that we use, it's a variety of these things: opinions of others, interpersonal influence, right? So kind of discussions with your closest friends or your partners, what's in the news, and that could be any of those forms of news. It can also be your party identification, ideology, or in the US, party identification or ideology and religiosity are two of the strongest determinants of our opinions and attitudes about things. And that kind of distinguishes us from a lot of different countries where those aren't as large drivers. Of course, we're in a two-party system where we have really strong polarizing kind of messages that we see. So it's kind of easy for us to choose one and kind of say, well, this is a politician that I trust that identifies with my party. I'm just going to go with what they say, right? Very, very common heuristic. Or again, my pastor says this, I trust him or her, that's what, I'm going to go with. When we consider the complexities of cultural differences through a community-engaged research lens, or CER, I think that we are better able to kind of navigate some of these controversial science issues or these wicked science issues. As Dietram and others have said, the challenges posed by post-normal scientific developments demand new and more effective infrastructure for citizen engagement. So a lot of work that we do and work that I did in grad school specifically was around kind of like public engagement with science. If you've ever submitted an NSF grant, you probably have seen that you have to kind of explain what the broader impacts of your research are going to be. Horizon 2020 in the EU also has these kinds of requirements in their grant making or proposal process. And we're seeing this kind of pop up throughout the scientific community, not only in the US, but around the world, asking for an explanation of how the science that you're conducting is going to have some kind of impact on the world around us for the benefit of the world around us, right? In Wisconsin, at UW, the Wisconsin idea is exactly that, right? Doing research that has impacts beyond the university. And so how do we actually do that, right? There's all these calls for this, but actually doing it and doing it in a way that's very meaningful is difficult. And there is a ton of research about public engagement and citizen engagement, community engaged research, and it comes from a lot of different spaces. So if you're really interested, there's some great community engagement research methods and theory courses that are taught here. But the original stuff or the seminal work, I believe, in community engaged research or community-based participatory research really comes from the public health space. But it's been adapted into other areas in sustainability and human ecology and elsewhere. In science communication, we've talked about it a little bit differently, and because we're often talking about communication and how information is getting from one audience to the other. So I'm just going to kind of show just a few of the ways that the way we think about public engagement in my field has evolved over time. It's been defined in a trillion different ways as public communication, public consultation, public participation, with different directionality of how that information is going from one entity to the other. In one of Dietram's earlier papers, he explained that, the knowledge deficit model, that's kind of what I explained before. If you just give facts to people, it's unlikely to impact their opinions. That was a really common way of thinking about information. Then it kind of public engagement with science was thinking of this in a two-way interaction. So you give people information and then they kind of give it back to you or give feedback back to you. But then, he developed this model a little bit further to add media into it, right? Because media is such a huge component of of how we get information. So actually all of the scientific facts and realities are mediated through our media realities, and they impact how we view things. We've also looked at public engagement with science based on in terms of what's the goal of that engagement, what are the principles of the engagement, and how do you actually do it? So lots of definitions here. This is kind of a way to think about that evolution a bit more. The informing people about something, very one-directional. Similarly, consulting, another form of kind of semi-two-directional, but still really you're exchanging something, or transactional really. Deliberation, where there's kind of conversations happening. If you've heard of kind of deliberative models of research, bringing people together to kind of understand how they think about something and provide them information and get some feedback back. But then this kind of co-creation part here, these two I want to highlight, because this is kind of where a lot of the community engaged research that I do kind of fits in. Is either this kind of deliberation space where we're really kind of in this preliminary space working with people to understand their thoughts and ideas about something, or we're actually working with the stakeholders that we're engaging and they're informing and changing the research process as we're working with them. So they're integrated into the process itself. Researchers must engage meaningfully with decision makers and stakeholders in processes of knowledge co-production that incorporate diverse perspectives transparently. There are a lot of people in the research space that are making arguments that are similar to this, that it's really imperative that we're being more inclusive in how we are making decisions about science issues or other controversial or relevant issues in society. And one way that we can do that is through knowledge co-production. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The Kellogg Foundation defines community engaged research as a collaborative approach to research that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. These are some kind of co-principles of community engagement, the ways in which, the things that you want to kind of abide by to make sure that your research and the engagement that you're doing is not extractive in any way, or somehow like hurtful to the community that you're working with. The theory of knowledge co-production that I mentioned before, and this is work that has really kind of helped guide how I do my work and how I kind of develop the methodology around this community engaged research. And the idea is that your research is context-based, so you have to know what your context is for it to be context-based, that it recognizes the value of different forms of knowledge, right? Expert knowledge, but there's, I always kind of laugh at this idea that there is expert knowledge, because really, like, anybody can be an expert in a variety of things, so we have to understand or define what the expertise is that we're interested in, and then really understand, a neighborhood watch committee might have knowledge about what's happening in their community around crime and safety that the mayor doesn't, right? And there might be different perceptions of expertise in that situation, and finding ways to recognize those different levels and understand the value of these different forms of knowledge. The work should be action-oriented, so it's not writing papers that kind of sit on the wall or sit in a drawer, as my advisor always likes to say. We don't want research that sits in a drawer. We want research that has an impact on society, on the communities that we're working with. And then it also includes interactive engagement of some form. And there's like so many ways that this could be, like lots of different ideas for engaging different communities. I have methods that I think are like more fun and seem to work better, but there are a lot of things that you can do. Some of the kind of broad questions that I ask when I'm thinking about how to work with a community is how is this community perceiving their role in addressing X challenge? How do they make decisions about those local efforts? And so part of that is really understanding the decision-making processes in a community or a local context, and who are those different players and those different stakeholders that might impact that decision-making process. Public participation is really useful to provide input about social change and deal with serious social challenges. And that type of participation may look very different depending on who you're talking to, and the levels of knowledge that they might have about any given thing, right? And if you're talking about one aspect of an issue, there might be experts that have no knowledge about that, but are really, really knowledgeable about a different aspect of that issue. And so kind of being able to map out what are all of the aspects of climate change in a local community, in Wisconsin perhaps, what is that community facing, and how is that issue maybe intersecting with other local issues that they're dealing with, and how can we figure out who are the actors that we want to involve in this process, how can we build trust with them and incorporate their viewpoints into the research. So this is really trying to understand who are the stakeholders involved in local decision making, and how can that involvement extend beyond kind of these maybe opinion leaders of a community. One thing I really want to note is that it's really important to build trust. If you're working with communities, trust, I cannot overstate the importance of trust. There's lots of research to show that people are a lot more receptive to information if it comes from a trusted source, which seems like duh, but it's really important. And there are ways that we can kind of think about trust so that we can ensure that we are building it meaningfully. So some determinants of trust are related to knowledge and expertise, openness and honesty, and concern and care. So kind of there's research around this to kind of understand what do you need to be aware of as a researcher to ensure that you're not potentially, shooting yourself in the foot. Because there's a lot of ways to erode trust and credibility, like ignoring or downplaying perceptions of risk that people might have. A lot of folks, it was a beautiful feat of science that we got the COVID vaccine as fast as we did. But I think there are probably a lot of scientists that were surprised at the social implication of some people not wanting to take it, right? And the fears that they had around that vaccine. Ignoring or downplaying their perceptions of risk because of what the science says to that technical expert is not going to help with the message of helping them to get vaccinated if that's what we care about, right? trying to persuade our audiences that experts are right or their perceptions are wrong, so kind of similar to that first one. People believe what they believe, and it's really hard to change people who have really extreme or deep-rooted beliefs or attitudes about things. And so we have to be very careful that we aren't coming off or aren't actively trying to persuade, right? There's a lot of folks, there's a lot of research in my field that is focused on persuasion and persuasion tactics and methods. That is strictly not what we do because we're not trying to persuade. We're interested in how perceptions of publics impact a community or the ways in which knowing more about what they think about something might have an impact on decision-making processes. But we are interested in what they think, not how to get them to think a certain way, because it can really erode trust. Concealing risk or scientific uncertainty. COVID was also a really good example of this because the science was happening so fast. It was really hard to talk about the uncertainty, and then you had lots of research coming out and maybe media pundits or journalists taking headlines or sentences out of context to try and explain what was going on to the general public. It can get really sticky really fast if there are risks or scientific uncertainty that we are trying to communicate about an issue. And so understanding that, like acknowledging that it exists is really important, so that if we do find out, for example, the WHO said, the science says, masks work, we have to wear them, and then new science comes out that says, well, we've learned more about the effectiveness of masks, and this is it. That, you have to do it because science says so, and then, well, science is actually more nuanced. You lost a ton of people's trust in that communication, right? And that's kind of why we need to kind of think about how we're communicating about these things. And then lastly, assuming that education is the only answer. So kind of going back to that knowledge deficit thing. If we're just trying to give people information, it's not like we can't assume that that's going to work. What are more creative ways that we can reach people where they are rather than expecting them to reach us where we are? This is not a real model yet. This is from my dissertation, but it's kind of how I think about the community engaged research process and combining kind of qualitative and quantitative methods in a very collaborative way. So I call this the double helix methodology for post-normal science. So let's say, wickedness, some wicked issue, climate change in a local community. We build some partnerships to do community engaged research because they reached out to us and they want something done. Perhaps we do some interviews with them, we do a content analysis of all the news coverage about climate change in their community. Then we get all this information that is potentially useful, but it raises more questions. Hopefully, or potentially, those questions are testable. We can maybe use some quantitative, like survey experiments, to try to test some of those new questions that we have. But survey experiments can only tell us so much, right? And especially if they're in really controlled environments. So then we need to do more qualitative data analyses to try to understand, what does this mean that we found? How do people interpret it? Does it actually align with what we found earlier just by talking to community members? Maybe we need focus groups with different audiences because we're seeing different perceptions with, Democrats versus Republicans in the community, or the rural folks versus the city folks, depending on what we're looking at. And while all of this is occurring, wickedness can happen, meaning like a pandemic can happen, right? Climate change could happen in ways that we're not expecting. There could be really extreme storms. There could be changes in droughts, in how our crops are kind of experiencing climate change. But throughout all of this are opportunities for communities to provide input into the research process, as kind of feedback to the findings of the research, into the design of future research. And so there's lots of opportunity, and ideally, it would just kind of like keep going. We would have research, we build on it, and throughout this, we're building relationships with this community that we're working with, and hopefully at some point, there's products along the way that are useful for decision making, or useful just as tools for a community to understand themselves better. Any questions so far? I'm going to jump into an example. Okay, so Steve's here. He's one of the folks that helps with this research project. Beloit is a city right at the south border of Wisconsin by Illinois. And there were a group of folks that came to Dominique, the chair of our department, and they saw her talk about climate change communication at a library event in Beloit. And they were like, oh, we're really interested in doing something about climate change in our community, but we're feeling like the local government's really sticky, and we're having a hard time kind of getting anything through. At the time, one of our partners was actually on city council and was really trying, an individual advocate for climate change to be on the docket and to be something that the community was really focused on from a policy perspective. And one of the things that she and others were able to do was to get this proclamation passed that the City Council of the City of Beloit supports state, federal, and international efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2040. So that was the proclamation that they got passed, but the problem with the proclamation is it's not actually any policy. There's no actual action associated with the proclamation, so to some it might seem a bit more like signaling, which could be a step in the direction that these partners are interested in, but they wanted to know more about what they could do. And so we worked with them to try to figure out, well, what is it that we're interested in and what would resonate well with the community, and how could we approach this issue to learn more. So what we decided on was we ended up doing, or I conducted 22 interviews with business, community, and government leaders, and we asked them about resilience and sustainability. Rather than immediately asking them about climate change, we kind of, in the research and in conversations with partners, we decided that it'd be interesting to know how Beloit thinks about these two concepts, in part because it's in a lot of the kind of government and city materials. So the Downtown Beloit Association talks about, being a resilient community. Within the city plans are the three-legged stool of sustainability that's related to economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And so we were interested in understanding, what does that mean to these folks and these opinion leaders in the community. And then also, how do they see climate change as an issue kind of situated among other community priorities that they might be more interested in? So some of the findings from these interviews, when understanding how resilience was defined, opinion leaders talked about it as the ability to bounce back, experiential. So what I mean by that is there were a lot of stories about Beloit, their perception of Beloit being resilient, and what that meant for, whether it's an economic recession or changes in the community. However, they also brought up a concern about there being kind of two sides of Beloit, east and west Beloit. There's a river that goes through the city, and potential social concerns around this kind of division of the community as maybe not being resilient, right? That a unified community would be more likely to be resilient. And I asked them, well, do you think Beloit is resilient? About 45% of participants said yes, but there were some mixed reviews. Some people didn't want to answer, a few did not think so, and then there were some mixed views. Kind of a lot of the mixed views were on this point of there being kind of differences in where resilience is in the city, and that, we talked about what community and what local means in the beginning. Within Beloit there are communities, like individual communities within the community of Beloit, and learning about what those are was really interesting. Sustainability, on the other hand, was thought about as a future that's built to last, very structural, talked about in terms of infrastructure and policy. And then, of course, the three legs of sustainability came up all the time because that's something that they've heard about. And in these conversations, what kind of I learned and came to was that there's this really cyclical relationship between resilience and sustainability. So reviewing the capacity to respond would make us more sustainable, but having capacity in the first place and adaptation measures in place for preparedness makes the city more resilient. So these things work together. It's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem. And how do you work on one or the other or both at the same time to meet the goals of the city? Then I also asked about the proclamation directly. Had they heard about it? Was I aware? Probably. That's one of my favorite quotes from that. There were a lot of mixed views on this. Granted, I was talking to the opinion leaders of the community, some of which, were working on this proclamation, right? Or were very aware of it because they're in city government. So there was a lot of awareness, but more unsureness than I was expecting. A lot of support for the government making a statement, but there was also a ton of skepticism that the proclamation was going to lead to any actionable steps, as well as resources available to make those steps. There was also a recognition for policy entrepreneurs that really made this their baby and were really focused on trying to get that through. A lot of respect for the folks that were very passionate about this. A sense of what climate change is, how it's perceived in Beloit among some of these opinion leaders. Can be kind of characterized by this quote, that my perception is that there's a recognition that things aren't the way they used to be. There's a feeling of being overwhelmed, and the problem is really much too big to really do much about. And I hear this all the time, like climate change is just too big, we can't do anything. But there are actually a ton of things that local communities can do that I'm sure a lot of you know about. So this was like an initial step in the research process, but we learned a lot from this. There were divergent perspectives based on how residents view the Beloit community, and that will likely drive future support for whatever local efforts come about. Communication tools, how we use resilience or sustainability as terms related to climate change. Resilience will probably be really useful as messaging for residents, but sustainability might be more useful in decision-making in more of those structural spaces. And then effective intersections between climate and existing priorities, and also what funding opportunities are available is going to require a lot of leadership and engagement across groups that already exist in the city. So maybe there's a group that really cares about housing. What is the intersection between climate and housing, right? There's a lot there with weatherization and how we can make our houses more energy efficient and more resilient. But are those groups working together towards some kind of shared goal? Do they even know that there's a shared goal that exists in the first place? So some of the next work that we're going to see is kind of identifying where those areas are. We are just about to send out a public opinion survey to residents in Beloit, to a sample of residents in Beloit, to ask them about their opinions about community issues, to get a better, a better idea of what they care about and where climate change fits in, if at all, within their priorities of their city. And that'll give us even more of an indication of what should we focus on so that we can be resonating with what the community actually cares about. I'm going to give just two quick highlights of work that I'm doing also. The first one is what we call the Consolidated Innovative Nuclear Research Project. It's a collaboration with 5 institutions, us, Pacific Northwest National Lab, New Mexico State, Oklahoma, and Michigan. And the point of the project is we are examining the process of consent-based co-design of a spent nuclear fuel facility with potential host communities and key stakeholders. So if you don't know much about the nuclear waste concern in the United States, right now a lot of spent nuclear fuel is at power plants in giant caskets, and the DOE would really like to create a single facility to bring it all to for a variety of reasons. And so we're trying to figure out, well, what would it even mean to involve communities in a conversation for such a risky issue like this, where there's a lot of public perceptions that already exist about nuclear power and nuclear waste. So we facilitated a community design workshop in May. We are just about to be facilitating a survey, a national survey about perceptions of the co-design process. We just did one workshop with technical experts in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're going to be doing another one here in April. And then we want to kind of bring technical experts and the community members that we engaged in May together into a single conversation where we talk about this process of co-designing a facility for spent nuclear fuel. And then we'll do a kind of public referendum survey after. So lots of steps in this and a very big team. Happy to talk about it more with anyone who's interested. Another project that is on campus that I'm excited about is the Clean Energy Community Initiative. It is a partnership between the College of Engineering, Life Sciences Communication, and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And basically we are working to accelerate Wisconsin's clean energy transition by understanding communities' values, needs, and priorities, and working with a broad range of stakeholders to engage with communities and figure out what it is that we can do to help the energy transition in their local community kind of move forward. And that could look very different. It could be like, getting EVs installed, or trying to create a microgrid, or, rooftop solar, whatever that might look like. We've got this kind of design for what this process could be and how working with communities could actually influence the technology design process, which is something that the College of Engineering is really interested in learning from. And just wanted to kind of highlight, I got the pleasure of visiting, I don't know if anyone's heard of Walnut Way. Do you guys know the Lindsay Heights neighborhood in Milwaukee? There's this neighborhood in Milwaukee. Lindsay Heights is kind of like west in the city, like west-north, and they have kind of high crime, high drug problems, but they also have like really, really strong community organizations, and one of them is called Walnut Way, and they're a conservation organization that's really focused on community sustainability, and they are very interested in energy technologies and really want to incorporate new technologies into their community to help them become more sustainable, and also to engage more community members to hopefully kind of shift the way in which their community is perceived and the things that are happening in it. So it can be a lot more kind of family oriented and focused on community initiatives that they care about. So lots of cool things. We're also working with the Oneida Nation and the Bad River Tribe on similar efforts, and hope we'll expand to other communities as we can. So that's kind of what I do and what I will continue to do. Happy to take any questions about kind of community engagement more broadly, or any of the specific projects that I've talked about. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thanks very much, Mikhaila. Super, super nice presentation. Very interesting for sure. I have questions, but I'll open it up to the audience first to see if folks questions that they'd like to.
Go for it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what is scientific literacy.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And there's this great, I think I showed on one of these slides, this great NASEM report that goes into it. So basically it's science literacy, this report, and I don't know if, has anyone looked at the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine, the website? They have like a ton of reports where they get experts together, and like top of the field experts to write about specific issues. This is one all about scientific literacy, but basically it's like access to science and how, whether using knowledge or creating it, necessitates, like it requires some amount of familiarity with science. And so science literacy is, there are different measures that we can use to measure science literacy, but it's basically like how familiar are people with science and how might that impact their perceptions of science issues, for example. But I highly recommend, because there's different types of science literacy, right? Like environmental literacy, health literacy. So definitely check out this resource if you're interested more in that.
Thank you so much, Mikhaila.
Yeah, great to see you.
I was wondering about like the difference in scale between like Beloit and then the whole country of the U.S. Like,
Yeah.
I'm so excited by that, and I'm curious how you see this work changing scale and working. I can see it working in Beloit, and I'm less clear on how it works nationally.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I think there's like something that I've seen where it's like all climate is local or something. I can't remember, but it's like a phrase about how the solutions to climate change are local. And I would argue that that's true. At least, you know, I mean, we've seen several IPCC reports. I think COP28 is going on right now, right? Lots of international conversations about what we can do about climate change, national conversations about what we can do about climate change, and we're not meeting any of those targets, right? we're not actually progressing in that way. And I think that shows me that we're missing something. Because we, at the same time, while during the Trump administration, you may have recalled kind of like an interest in defunding a lot of like EPA and other kind of climate related, taking climate change out of everything because it's a polarized name. But at the same time, you had governors across the country that, because the Trump administration wanted to get out of the Paris Accord. And then you had governors across the whole country come together and say, no, we're a part of the Paris Accord, right? So already in a kind of polarized political climate in the United States, local governments, or I guess state governments first, and then also local governments, were like, we want to have our own emissions goals, and we want to know how we can get there. Unfortunately, it's really hard, especially like in Wisconsin, local governments don't have a ton of control necessarily over some of the decision-making around adoption of technologies. And that changes state by state. There's a lot of complicated things that go into kind of like electricity transmission and pricing and who has power where. But the recent legislation, the IRA and IJA, has provided billions of dollars for state and local governments to do a lot of this work. So it definitely took a big push at the national level, and really, really smart, motivated folks, researchers and policymakers and other advocates that work to get that passed. But now we gotta figure out how to get it to communities, right? So that scale, so there's kind of like a scale down and then this also scale up thing. And I think your question raises was a question that I think about all the time is, how might the work in Beloit or my work with Walnut Way or the Oneida Tribe, how is that going to help me understand a model that we can use? Is it possible to create a model for a local community given the potential uniqueness of the local context, right? I'm not sure, but I would love, I hope that's my career, right? That's my plan, is to try to figure out how can we, scale this up. And one of the things that I think that we can do, and what we're really working on with the with CECI, is to build a network and to really build a community around clean energy in Wisconsin. And I'm talking about policymakers, industry leaders, nonprofits, local mayors, any community members that want, the universities, knowing what's going on in this area across the entire state and knowing who should call who at whatever point, how can we all work together even if our interests aren't always aligned. I think that developing those kind of networks of communities around these systems transition or wicked issues that society is facing, I would love to see a kind of community developed around AI. I think a lot of conversations about how we're regulating or how to regulate AI are happening right now, and I do think that it would be great to see a broad community where different voices and different stakeholders can come together to influence that decision making. But that's a big question, and I think that there's, you can work on it too, we can work together and figure that out. Yeah, other questions? And I'll follow you on one.
Well, yeah, maybe I'll ask one now and just try to, can I jump in, Steve? Just try to kind of build on this,
Yeah,
the
please.
Beloit part a little bit. And so, on one hand, we might think of Beloit as, relatively homogeneous when we think of the scale of the country, but the other hand, I'm sure it's not, right? And you were mostly focused on decision makers. I don't know how much the general public is represented by that.
Right.
But we know there are things like socioeconomic status that probably drives a lot about how much are you thinking about these things. And right, there's evidence that some socioeconomic status has the luxury to think about it more, and others it's like, look, I've got a lot more pressing issues on my mind right now. So does that play into this a little bit, that there might be a concern for it, but look, it can't be an issue for me because I have other more pressing issues?
Yeah, and I heard that a lot. I mean, I think that the most pressing issues that were cited in some of these conversations were education, crime, economic development, and poverty. And homelessness, and climate change, environmental things didn't come up at all, right, as priorities for most people. And that's why we were doing a public opinion survey, because we didn't ask the public what they think. Before you ask the public what they think, you kind of have to know what you're asking. right? And survey design is a whole science in of itself, and it can be quite complex, because if you ask questions in a way that is potentially leading, you can really screw up your reliability or validity of the data that you get. And so we have to be very precise and very methodical in how we're doing that. So I'm very excited to see, I'm hoping that people take it and that we can get some input from the public, because then we can combine that, compare it, and also compare it to national data, because we have national data about the same questions that we ask in the Beloit survey, and see, where does Beloit fit, and is it very unique compared to, the broader population. But yeah, so it's a good question, and I think there are different ways that we could do that and engage people. So this is, dissertation research leading into something. I would love to try a lot of other methods as well. I think that from this, once we have an idea of what the public thinks, then we can kind of develop some engagement activities or outreach events that kind of show what we learned from this research, but then also get feedback and make it more of an iterative process.
And Mandy Taylor, even who you're talking to, right?
Yeah, totally, because to your point, there are different communities within Beloit. There's that downtown area that's really there's a billionaire in the community that funds a lot of economic development stuff, but her perspective on what social issues matter are different than what other people think should be the focus of the community. So how can we try to align those things so that it's not just an us versus them thing, but a way that we can kind of work together? And I don't know. Beloit might seem homogenous in the grand scheme of things, but it is so diverse. It's actually a very unique community in Wisconsin in that way, which makes it even, I would say maybe potentially like a bellwether for local communities across the United States. So hopefully this research gives us some insight that we can write about that and try to make some arguments or develop models that help us think about this for other less homogenous communities. Yeah.
I'm not going to ask about Beloit.
Okay.
But I'm curious. My perception of what you presented today is that a lot of it is rooted in the assumption of information gathering and rational thought, that people might come to different conclusions based on, more or less a similar set of facts. But what about people who fundamentally differ on their mental constructs and rely much more on intuition and perceive common sense? In which case, it's a completely different way of using it. So your question about how do you gather information, who do you talk to?
Yeah.
No, my gut feeling is this, and nothing anybody can say is going to change that, because that's how I think. And
Yeah.
that's my identity, maybe.
That's a really good question,
Did you guys kind of hear the question in the back?
and measuring that gut reaction, or folks, we're working on developing survey items to try to differentiate this a little bit, like how people decide things more through intuition or values versus information. So TBD, but generally, if you're working with a bunch of folks that have gut reactions that influence their opinions about things, those gut reactions come from somewhere. And those are likely their value systems of some sort. So it might take a little bit more digging. A survey might not work, right? It might be that we need to have a community dinner and I'm sitting with just people like them to understand their perspective and really getting to know them. And trying to then, one project that unfortunately couldn't go anywhere that a partner or a colleague of mine, Nikki Krause, and I worked on early in grad school was we interviewed a bunch of stakeholders around the issue of nitrate pollution in water across Wisconsin. So we were talking to county conservationists, local health officials, as well as people at the DNR, farmers, as many kind of people that might have opinions about this. And it was amazing because there was a red thread through all of them. They all had a very similar perception about, nitrate in water is a problem and we do want to do something about it, but they were pointing at each other as the problem. And so, unfortunately we didn't get to keep doing that work, but that's kind of how I like to think about this, is how can I find that red thread? And maybe when we're talking about climate change, maybe it has nothing to do with climate change at all. And it has everything to do with some component of resilience that works for really conservative voters, and also works for the super liberal ones, right? If we're in a place where that's the identity that's really pushing some of these values and perceptions. But it's complex, right? And there is no one way to figure it out. You kind of have to try. That's why that double helix method is kind of, I think, going to be more effective for these things, because we are not gonna get all the information that we need to develop decisions just from one survey, right? It's just not gonna happen. So how can we incorporate different methods together to have opportunities to maybe capture some of these perspectives that wouldn't be captured in other work that is more traditionally done? Yeah. Cool. We're right at time, probably,
Can I ask one more quickly?
yeah,
Just
sure.
related to the nuclear one.
Yeah.
You said with the spent fuel rods, you're looking for community design workshops. What communities are you working with? Is this a community where those are currently stored and they're looking to get rid of them? Or is it a community where it might be going?
Right.
Or both?
So we are actually not working with any specific community. This project is really focused on the process of what would we do if we were to work with a community. So we've kind of had like a pseudo community. University of Oklahoma are the lead PIs of this project, and so we brought together a bunch of community members from central Oklahoma to this workshop. It was like, I think like 40 people from around central Oklahoma, and they were kind of our pseudo community that we were using to bring up this idea. But with them, a lot of what we were talking about was not just like why, like the risks and benefits of nuclear waste and why they might want it in their community or not, but also the process of working with scientists or regulators or developers on this, and what does the community want to get out of that relationship, that process itself, and how do we measure and evaluate that along the way so that we can apply it to other facilities that, you know, historically facility siting is not super great at engaging communities, right? A lot of facilities are just sited places, and the communities can deal with it. But we don't think that that's going to work for nuclear, and probably not for a lot of energy technologies that might have risks involved or that are new and people don't know anything about them. So.